Good morning and welcome to the 2021 Alabama Decorative Arts Symposium. We're so glad you could join us this morning for the first of our presentations. And I would first of all like to thank Alabama State Council on the Arts for their continued funding for our symposiums. This year, we were able to install an exhibit as well. It's called Plain and Simple, Fine and Fancy, a survey of Alabama Decorative Arts, and it's at the Crest Building on Dexter Avenue here in Montgomery. The funding actually helps us do this series of presentations as well. You can find the schedule of our Thursday mornings at 10 o'clock, Decorative Art Speakers, at the Landmarks Foundation link.com off of their website to the Decorative Arts exhibit. Next week's speaker will be Joey Brackner. He'll be speaking on slinging mud, Alabama potters, and the politics in the late 19th century. But today, our presenter for our first presentation will be Sarah Bliss Wright of Mobile. Sarah Bliss is an Alabama native, and she spent 30 years of her career in the performing arts industry before turning her attention to textile arts. In 2006, she became very interested and decided to create a crazy quilt from her late father's neckties, and that led to an ongoing love for quilting and adding that to her other creative pursuits as well. And I'm very grateful to Sarah Bliss for making the completion of the recent publication, Alabama Quilts, Wilderness to World War II, possible. So today, as a quilt and fiber arts historian, Sarah will be talking about a project that's very near and dear to her heart, the Mt.Ida Quilt Project, one community, two quilts, and 3 centuries. Take it away, Sarah Bliss.
Thank you, Carol. I am thrilled and delighted to kick off the Decorative Arts Symposium with this fabulous quilt, the story that has 2 sides to it. I mean, a beautiful quilt made in 1851 is, I think, the perfect example of plain and simple, fine and fancy. Okay, let me tell you this story of the Mt.Ida Quilt Project. I actually grew up not in Mobile, but in a little town called Talladega that is right there in the middle of the cotton belt, as we all know it in the South. And after I decided that maybe I needed to have another creative outlet besides performing arts, I found out about this group called the American Quilt Study Group. And I thought, okay, I'm going to join that group because I need another pursuit. And as soon as I joined them, I found out that they have a quilt study every other year in which you take an old quilt and study it and learn something new from it or be inspired by it. And no sooner had I joined this American Quilt Study Group than they came up with their 2014 quilt study that was going to be about quilts made during the Civil War era, 1850 to 1865. And I was not going to do this project. I didn't have that much time on my hands, but I thought it would be interesting to just have an exercise in pursuing that idea. So what better place than Alabama's Department of Archives and History to find a quilt that I might study if I had chosen to do so. So sure enough, I found out that there was a quilt there that had been donated to our Archives and History in 1958 by a woman who said that this quilt had been made in 1851. So it was the perfect example of the Civil War era quilts. And it had been made at Mt.Ida Plantation by a group of women, most of whom were named Reynolds or Mallory or Welch. And the donor of the quilt actually said all she knew about these women was that they were Mallorys and Welches, and they were somehow related to Mrs. Reynolds, who was her great-grandmother. And I thought, you know what, I'm not going to do this quilt study of the American Quilt Study Group, but I could help Archives and History flesh out a little bit more information about this fabulous quilt, because not only am I from Talladega, but I grew up right down the road from where Mt.Ida plantation had stood. And here is that fabulous Greek Revival plantation house as it was shown in the Habs survey in the 1930s. So I thought, okay, I can do this. Here is the quilt. 12 women, each made a square. We know that they were Mallory's or Welch's, but that was really all that Archives and History knew about it. Well, being from that area, I thought, okay, I'm going to flesh out this story and I'll be done with this project. So I thought, wait a minute, 1958 was when this woman donated the quilt. 2013 was when I found out about it. And think about the changes that came about in how you could research things between 1958 and 2013. 1958, you actually had to go to your local courthouse or your local library. 2013, you can research so much in the comfort of your own home, wearing your pajamas, drinking your coffee. So I thought, okay, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to find out who these 12 women were, and I'm going to use online resources, look at all the things that are available. The Bureau of Land Management, you can find out about property. You have census records online. Well, you can even go to your local library if you really want to get up and get dressed. And I had access to the Talladega County Library and all of these local resources that were there that might not be available online. So I thought, okay, this is going to be a fun project. So let's take the first of these women that we know about. Hannah Reynolds, we know from the donor that her father was Oliver Welch, who came to Alabama from Virginia. And I said, okay, I'm going to find out a little bit more about this Hannah Welch Reynolds. But first of all, why? Why did they come to Alabama in 1834? Well, if you remember your fourth grade Alabama history, you remember that until 1830, that portion of Alabama that you can see outlined in little red dots was still Creek Indian territory. Even though Alabama had become a state in 1819, not all of what we know as Alabama was included in that. And in the last of the treaties with the Creek Indians, that land outlined in red was ceded to the U.S. government, and it was open for settlement. So why did people come from Virginia to Alabama? Well, it was a new subdivision. They wanted new land. And they were able to get this land by having a land patent in their names. That's a document that shows that you are the first owner of this land. The land patent comes from the U.S. government. Well, here I am researching this easily. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go to the land records that are online at Bureau of Land Management. And I know two names, Mallory and Welch. And I know that this house was in Talladega County. So I'm going to see if I can find the first thing, and that is the land grant for somebody named Oliver Welch. And so I type in Oliver Welch and Talladega County, and bingo, look at that. First thing that comes up is down at the bottom, Oliver Welch and James Mallory. Well, clearly these two people were connected, but even better than that, see down there, bottom left, you can click on that little image thing and get an actual image of the land grant. So there it is. Oliver Welch of Talladega County was the assignee of James Mallory, meaning that James Mallory purchased this land in the name of Oliver Welch. I thought, okay, well, this is going pretty well. So I thought, let's go to the second one. We know that Oliver Welch we know who that person is, but there's somebody named James Mallory. And on the quilt, there were 3 women with the last name of Mallory. So which one of those might have been the wife of James Mallory, if we're trying to identify who these women were? Now, these 3 women actually gave the names of their plantation homes, Anne Marie and Johanna and Mary, but I need to know a little bit more about them in order to determine who who these people were. So I went to James Mallory's journal. He kept an agricultural journal that was published in 1997 by the University of Alabama Press, but he doesn't help me out in what the name of his wife was, because he said myself, my wife, and infant Virginia came from Virginia. Well, that doesn't help me in trying to determine which one of these Mallory women on the quilt was James's wife. So I went to, he said later that they were joined by their relative, Oliver Welch. So we're making a stronger connection between these Mallorys and Welches in that we know now that they were relatives. I found out online also that Oliver Welch left Virginia because he said he wanted to come to a new place where his children might possess the lands around them. Well, in Virginia, I would imagine that most of the land had already been granted to folks, and this was a new subdivision opening up, and this land in Alabama is beautiful stuff. So he did something for his children. But back to our story, if you want to find out who James Mallory's wife was, if you look at the 1840 census, only the head of the household was listed, no names of the other members of the household. But go to the 1850 census, and sure enough, there it is. Every member of the household is listed, and we can find out then that James Mallory's wife was named Anne. So if we go back to our list of the 12 quilt makers, now we know something about Hannah. We know something about Anne Mallory, who lived at Selwood. And you do the same thing using the census records for each of those 12. There's Anne Mallory, and there's Johanna Mallory. You find out through census records that her husband's name was John. There's Anne Wallace. She's one of the quilt makers. Her husband's name is Robert. And down at the bottom, you see Mary Mallory, but she's married to Nathaniel. But notice the census taker misspelled the last name and spelled it Mallery. And so you learn quickly that in dealing with census records, you have to use various spellings if you're looking for last names or first names. Okay, Sarah Welch. Well, my goodness, look, she's married to Oliver Welch, and he's a Baptist preacher. He also is 17 years older than his wife. Interesting. Well, we keep on. Mary White is only 18 years old when she's working on this quilt. There's Mary Welch. And then Fanny Burt was one of the quilt makers' names. And on the census records, there's a Frances Burt. But then you know by common sense that Fanny was a nickname for Frances. And also within her family unit, there's a little 5-year-old girl named Martha Welch. So somehow Frances or Fanny Burt was connected to the Welches. So we're getting closer and closer to identifying the 12 women on the quilt. There they are. Now we know their names, their husbands' names, and their ages when they were working on this quilt. I thought I was just going to be able to turn that over to Archives and History. But then I kept thinking, why did these 12 women make this quilt? But I mean, clearly there was a reason that they got together and did this. If you go back to one of the local resources, James Mallory's journal was, of course, chronological. And if you go back to 1851, you find an entry in his journal that said his eldest daughter, Virginia, was married to her second cousin, James Welch. Oh, these 12 women, all relatives of the Mallorys and the Welches, got together to make a quilt as a wedding present. What a lovely thing to do. Now, we won't dwell on the fact that they were cousins, because we know that during that time, cousins often married. Well, here it is, the wedding. November of 1851, there's the bride, there's the groom. And so, story done. I was ready to just tidy this all up and take it to Archives in History and say, okay, here are your 12 quilt makers. We know a little bit more about them, and we know the relationship that they had between the bride and the groom. Done. Sort of. I kept going back to that Alabama Quilt Study Group project about this quilts made during the Civil War era. And I thought, okay, what if, now we're not going to do this, but what if we wanted to do a quilt that was a study quilt and use this quilt as our reference? What if I found somebody that lives on the land that each of these quilt makers lived on in 1851, and I got that 21st century woman to adopt the 19th century woman and recreate her square? Wouldn't that be fun? I mean, something fun to think about. But I thought, okay, we are not going to do this, but I'm going to see who lives on this land of these 12 women. Well, in order to do that, I got to find out exactly where the 12 original quilt makers lived. So if I took Mary Mallory, just for example, if I go to the 1850 census, I see that her husband is William Mallory. And since it was usually the man who owned the property, I went back to the land grants and I searched for property in Talladega County that William Mallory would have had. And lo and behold, there it is. William Mallory purchased land, and it gave the section, the township, the range. We all know about map reading, don't we? And there it is. That's where Mary Mallory would have lived. So if I take that section, township, and range map of Talladega County, number 8 was Mary Mallory, that we just found out what section she lived in. That's where Mary lived. I did the same thing for the other 11 quilt makers, put them on the map. And as you can see, number 1 is where Hannah Reynolds lived at the Mt.Ida plantation. And it's sort of central to the other quilt makers. Number 11 and 12 lived across the Coosa River over in Shelby County. But the rest of them, except for number 3, who lived in the city of Talladega at that time, they were all within 8 square miles of each other. That's an easy afternoon horseback ride. So I thought, okay, I got to find who lives on this property now. Clearly, I had way too much time on my hands at this point in my life. And Hannah Reynolds was going to be the easy one. I knew exactly where Mt.Ida plantation was, and I knew exactly who lives there now. My friend Ann and her husband had bought the property. Unfortunately, Mt.Ida had been destroyed by fire in 1956. So Ann and her husband had built a house on an adjoining hilltop from where Mt.Ida plantation house had stood. So I called Ann and I said, Ann, what would you think about doing this project if we did it? She said, oh yeah, it sounds interesting. Okay, well, that was easy. Well, I also needed to have another central location. So my sister Gina lives in a house that is right down the road from where Fanny Burt's house stood. That's Fanny Burt over on the left-hand side. And that's her home that stood until the 1980s, just down the street from Gina's house. And as it turns out, Fanny Burt's sister actually lived in the house where Gina now lives at a portion of time during the Civil War era. I asked Gina about it, and she said, "Oh, yeah, sure, count me in." Well, I still needed to have, of course, the mother of the bride. So I called my friend Carolyn, whose family lives where Selwood Plantation lived, and that was where the mother of the bride lived. Carolyn said she was in. I thought, wait, this is going way too well. We might actually have to do this project. My friend Ann Stapleton lives in that area. We're not sure exactly where Johanna Mallory lived, but Ann Stapleton's great-grandfather was a contemporary of all of these people and went to church with them. Ann said, "If I'm still around, count me in on this project. It sounds great." Well, as you can see, it gets easier and easier. I called Lucy because Ann Mallory Jenkins is buried in the cemetery on Lucy's property, and Ann Mallory Jenkins' house still stands, and there it is, right next door to Lucy's house. Mary Jane Mallory's house still stands, and my friend Nancy lives on the road that you have to pass by Nancy's house to get to Mary Jane's house. Sarah Welch, the stepmother of the groom, is buried in the cemetery that's right in front of Thornhill that you see there in the middle. Thornhill House still stands and was actually the home of Sarah Finley Welch's sister. So Sarah visited this house often. And Cindy, that you see on the right, the 21st century woman, is the caretaker of not only the house and the cemetery. And she said, "Sure, count me in." This had gone way too well. There's always one phone call that you dread to make. This is my sister, Debbie. And I called her and I said, "Debbie, I've got this great project that you need to be a part of." And she said, "You want me to do what?" "No, I don't think so." I said, "Oh, come on, it'll be fun. And I need for you to do this because this Mary Jane Finley White lived in this house that still stands, and it's 2 blocks from my sister's house." And I said, "You've got to adopt this girl. It really will be fun." And Debbie said, "Do you know how many times in my life you have told me something's going to be fun and it's not?" But she didn't want to miss out. So Debbie was in. I'm batting 1,000 at this point. Mary Welch Mallory, by the time I called Millie, who lives near the spring where all of these people were baptized in the 1850s, she said, "Oh, I've already heard about your project and I was hoping you would call me." So Millie is in. Mary Jane Wilson Welch lived in this house that still stands, and Lou's cousins owned the house. So she said, "Oh, yeah, count me in. This sounds like fun." Willie Wallace Welch is buried in Dell's cow pasture. She said, "I'm not very good at artwork, but sure, I'll do this." And then, of course, I had to save one for me. And Ann Mallory Wallace lived across the Coosa River. Well, I live across the Coosa River. Mobile is sort of across the Coosa River. So I adopted her. 12 out of 12. I made 12 phone calls and everybody said yes. So I thought, okay, we might actually do this, but we can, if we crash and burn, no, we don't have to do it. We'll just have fun thinking about it. So we had a meeting, these 12 women had a meeting, and we met at Gina's house, which you see there, because it is like Mt.Ida. It was central to the geographic area of where these women live. So the 12 women got together and we said, okay, the first thing we need is we've got to have a name for us. So we named ourselves the Mt.Ida Society. But as we talked about it, we said, you know what? The one thing that's different about these 19th century women and the 21st century women is that we tend to isolate ourselves now. We have air conditioning. We don't sit out on the front porch and rock in the afternoon. We wave at each other as we pass by in our air conditioned cars without the windows rolled down. Would we, by working on this project together as neighbors, would we recreate the sense of community that clearly these women who were all related to each other must have felt in 1851? And we all sort of bought into this idea. Now, we also bought into the idea that we may have bitten off more than we could chew. So we agreed that we actually needed to go see the original quilt. And if we were going to do it, we had to have some kind of template of the originals. We'd have to find appropriate fabrics. And oh, by the way, none of us were quilters. We had some needle skills, not a single quilter in this whole group. I mean, we weren't going to do it, but we were going to have fun talking about it. So we went to Montgomery. Archives and History was gracious enough to pull out this beautiful quilt for us to see. And when we walked into the room, we said, oh my goodness, this is truly a masterpiece. I mean, look at the size of this quilt and look how gorgeous it is. We put on our white gloves. We each took our little schematic that we had of our individual squares and the information that we had about the woman that we were going to adopt. And we inspected it. And we saw that they were unique. They all had applique and embroidery to make the detail of it stand out. I mean, it is a magnificent quilt. So we sort of got cold feet then and started chickening out. But we went ahead with our idea of, if we were going to do this, here's what we would need. Here is what this Mt.Ida quilt looks like. If you really break it down into what you would have to study if you were going to do this. It's 12 squares. They were 28-inch squares. They were huge. It was cotton, but it looked like solids, but they were actually tiny prints. I mean, everything from the batting to the liberal embroidery and the little 1-inch clamshell quilting pattern that they used. I mean, we really studied this thing and said, we can't do this. I mean, where are we going to buy the fabric? Well, where did they buy the fabric? I mean, every step of the way, we were starting to learn something about this plain and simple, fine and fancy quilt. So where did they buy their fabric? We went back to James Mallory's journal, because you got to remember, they just moved to this area in the 1830s. And this is 1850. Talladega was a town, but it still was very rural. But James Mallory gives us a clue in that he talks about sending the cotton from their fields to Wetumpka. You go back to your Alabama history again, and there's this little glimmer of recognition of something called the Plank Road, the Central Plank Road. These farmers that moved to Talladega County recognized that they had to have a better way, a quicker way of getting their products to Mobile, which was where the ports were. So they needed to get their cotton from Talladega County to Mobile in order to sell it. So they built themselves a plank road in 1850, and they were able then to haul their cotton from Talladega along the plank road to Wetumpka, which is where steamboats could pick it up and take it to Mobile. Once the seller had taken it to Mobile, then the reverse was true. I'm sure that the women in Talladega County sent a shopping list to Mobile with the guy that was selling the cotton and said, on the return trip, would you make sure to bring me some fabric? Because, of course, Mobile was a very old city, and they had all sorts of sources for things in Mobile. And these are the types of fabrics and fashions that were available. So, yeah, these women sent a shopping list to Mobile and probably had the fabrics brought back up from there. So they easily could have gotten their fabrics. So we said, okay, we can find fabrics. We went to Lowe's or Home Depot and we got us some color swatches and we got a list of the types of fabrics that we would need if we were going to do this. And we went shopping. Well, here we are. We're still together pursuing this ridiculous idea that we were going to make these squares. So we shared this fabric and we started to work on our applique. Since none of us actually knew what we were doing, we practiced our applique stuffed with cotton from around Mt.Ida. And then we said, okay, if we were going to do this, we'd need a template. So we reduced the 28-inch squares to 12-inch squares, because if we were going to make this little replica quilt, it had a maximum number of inches in dimensions. So it needed to be no bigger than 12-inch squares. And, why not? We all had some needle skills. So we started to work on applique if we were going to do this. But as we worked together on these things, one of the reasons that we were going to do this was to see if we could create the same sense of neighborhood, togetherness that the women had in 1851. Well, one of the things that we needed to do was to contemplate the fact that we were actually looking out the window at the same scenery that they would have looked at. And it gave us a chance to research each of these women. Now, we first met at Gina's house, and she had adopted Fanny Burt, and we found out a little bit more through research about Fanny Burt. So as we're there in Fanny Burt's house, basically, or very close to it, we talked about who this woman was. She was related to George Washington. Her first husband, Mr. Welch, had died at the age of 35. And she remarried to a Mr. Burt, but she had a daughter, Martha Welch. Remember on the census record when we talked about how there was a little 5-year-old girl, Martha Welch? Well, that's Fanny Burt's 5-year-old daughter. Little Martha, as it turns out, grew up to be a journalist. She moved to California, but she wrote stories about her childhood in Talladega County. And through those stories that were published, we were able to learn a whole lot more about the time period in which these 12 women were making this quilt. And if you go back to plain and simple, fine and fancy, well, here's some of the fancy. Little Martha talked about how the young folks would go horseback riding, and they could stop at Orangevale, Thornhill, Mt.Ida. So it gives us an indication that, yeah, they could go by horseback between each other's houses in an afternoon ride. So it gives us a sense of how they would visit with each other, how they shared fabrics. Little Martha, as a journalist, also gave us a clue as to why they picked the floral applique designs that they did. They were clearly all original designs, but she said that her mother taught her how to sew. So clearly they knew how to sew. They had needle skills. And she worked in a beautiful flower garden. Well, they brought their gardening skills with them, and they enjoyed beautiful gardens. So they must have been inspired by floral things. So that's why they picked this as their applique designs. Well, we decided that we were going to have a goal if we were going to do this. So, first goal is take your little fabric samples, your template, and just do as much of it as you think that you can. But don't be stressed over it. Our second get together was in June. Now, remember, our first get together was in January. Our second get together is in June, just as a progress report. Let's see if we're still having fun. Do we still feel like we are neighbors? And sure enough, we're all still in. I thought out of 12 women, we would crash and burn. But here we are at Selwood, the home of the mother of the bride, looking out at the same land that they looked out at in 1951. And we're using 21st century technology as we try to recreate these 12 squares and the lives of the women who made them. And Mallory, the mother of the bride, we find out that while she's working on this quilt, she's also building a new house that cost her $1,150. A lot of money in 1852. Wouldn't we love to have the materials that they had then? We also found out through James Mallory's journal that they believed in education for women. They sent their daughter, bride, to a female Masonic institute. We also found out that the mother of the bride in 1847, now this is before the wedding, she had 12 or 15 teeth taken out. Too bad there weren't any cameras around to make any wedding portraits. But even without 12 or 15 teeth, he says in a later entry in his journal, he returned home to the smiles and welcome of the best of wife. He did not care. He loved her regardless of how many teeth she had. Think about the things these women endured in 1851. Well, we're moving along. We're all still working on it. We want to finish our applique. So we get together in September just to see how well we're doing. We can show, we can tell, we can confess that we've done nothing. Some of us, we're doing pretty well, We're still laughing. We're still friends. We're still enjoying learning more about the people that were on this land before we were. Now, you see Nancy sitting there. There's an overachiever in every group. In our group, that was Nancy. This was her second square. She wasn't satisfied with her first square, so overachiever Nancy had already made 2 squares. She also was the one then that we decided we'd call when any of the rest of us were in a ditch with our squares. Well, we need to talk about Mary Mallory while we are there, where she had lived. We found out that they sort of moved down here after the rest of the family came. They came down 10 or 12 years later, and they had a 16-year-old daughter named Betty that came with them. But right before they started working on this quilt, poor Betty, 16 years old, caught the fever and died. Their 16-year-old daughter, just having moved to Talladega County, 16-year-old Betty died. But Anne Mallory was the woman I had adopted. She was pregnant at the time that she was working on this quilt square, and she delivered her little baby and named her after her sister, Betty, who had just recently died. So clearly the family is close. Well, we still haven't crashed and burned yet on creating these squares. And we realized that if we're going to do this, we've got to embroider them. And this is where our confidence level kicked in a little bit, because though we were not quilters, we all had some needle skills. We had all done some kind of embroidery. So all we needed to do was remind ourselves of our stitches. We got books to look at all of the the stitches that were available to us to remind us of them. And of course, overachiever Nancy is there helping us along the way. But then somebody brought this book. We did not appreciate the fact that somebody thought that we needed Quilting for Dummies. We did not. We moved on with our own knowledge and experience that we were developing. Well, okay, we hadn't talked about batting yet. As it turns out, the original had wool as batting because they had sheep as part of their farm. We didn't have any sheep, so we decided we would need to pick cotton from the fields around Mt.Ida if we were going to be authentic with this. If they hadn't had sheep, they clearly would have used cotton as their batting. So here we are. If you want to know how to stop traffic in Talladega County on a Sunday afternoon, you get 12 middle-aged women out there picking cotton, and traffic would indeed stop. We were the source of amusement for a lot of people who slowed down to watch us picking cotton in these fields. But if you are going to be authentic with it, you take it to the nth degree. But there was one thing we failed to consider. Where in the world were we going to find a little cotton gin in 2013? Well, as it happens, I had a connection in Tennessee where Bemis Cotton Mill had been. And these very fine gentlemen there in Tennessee had a little teeny tiny cotton gin. And they took our cotton, they ginned it for us, and the very nice UPS man brought it back to us afterwards. So, see, we have no excuse for why we're not going to finish this project. November comes, there we are. We're at Alpine, the home of one of the quilters, and we said, okay, let's see how far we've gotten. We brought our squares, we began to piece it together and see that we might actually have a quilt by the time this thing is done. We needed to talk about Mary Jane Wilson Welch, the woman who lived in the house where we were standing. One of the things that we learned, that we were reminded of actually, was how many of these women lost infants. Not only 16-year-olds that died of the fever, but here is Mary Welch's little infant daughter who only lived a few months in 1842. Now, we're also reminded, because one of her children scratched his name in the side light of the door at the house, we're reminded that they had lots of children and that some of them did survive to adulthood. So there's W.P. Welch, one of her sons, who scratched his name there in the glass. Well, we recognized that we're actually going to finish this project, but we must sign our names to our squares. And we decided that we would adopt the original quilt maker, but add our own names to the and the year that we finished it to each of our squares. So, I mean, clearly we're moving along with this. It's no surprise to you that we said, okay, let's finish this. December comes, we turn in our squares, we put them out on the dining room table and toast our accomplishments. We actually did this and we had fun doing it. Did we accomplish our goals? Yeah, here we are in Talladega, and we're just a block down the road from where Mary Jane Finley White, one of the quilt makers, had lived. She was only 19 when she worked on this, and look at the skill that she had in that beautiful square that she made. Now, we also found out that her mother was actually the stepmother of the groom for this wedding quilt. She was a Methodist preacher's daughter, but she married the Baptist preacher. And they only married in 1848. So they were both adults with grown children when they married. We also found out that the Methodist preacher's daughter, having married the Baptist preacher in 1855, there was an entry in the church records that said she burst the bands of Methodism by joining the church at Alpine Baptist Church. I thought that was such a funny phrase of bursting the bands of Methodism. It sounds almost like a cult, doesn't it? No offense to any of the Methodists out there. So we find out a little bit more about Mary Jane and about Sarah. And we realize, okay, we got to get this cotton. There it is, the freshly ginned cotton back. We're on a roll here. We're on a deadline. We got to get this thing finished. So we called in the only person we knew in our neighborhood who had actually taken this project from start to finish, had made quilts, had picked the cotton for the quilts, and could show us precisely how to use raw cotton in a quilt. And that's our friend Catherine Collins, who absolutely was an invaluable resource for us. We put that fresh cotton out there. It looked like it had snowed in the dining room, and patted it out nice and smooth, rolled it up, and it's ready to go to be quilted. Now, lest you think that we 12 women didn't actually have a little angel looking over our shoulders. This is Beth, a very accomplished quilter who was our 13th quilter in this project that involved 12 women. Beth was behind us, guiding us all along the way, and she was going to teach us all how to do hand quilting because she does beautiful work. Now, we got together at the site of Mt.Ida, which is where we think that the quilt was put together. So we're all there at Mt.Ida for Beth to teach us how that we are going to quilt this little teeny tiny quilt. We each took our turns in doing at least one clamshell, and even the left-handed quilters. And while we're there, of course, we're going to talk about Hannah Reynolds, because we're on the property looking out at the site that she would have looked out at. And Hannah's husband, Walter Reynolds, was one of the wealthiest men in the state of Alabama. He was a legislator, he was a businessman, he was a cotton farmer. And in James Mallory's journal, he makes a note in 1851, just weeks before this wedding that they're making a quilt for. And he says, Mr. Reynolds lost his little son, Oscar. And it struck me once again, the phrasing, Mr. Reynolds lost his little son. And I thought, oh, but what about Mrs. Reynolds? If you look back in the cemetery records there, and you see that Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds lost an infant daughter in 1847 on January 1st. 2 days later, they lost their little 2-year-old son, Walker. And then just a few years later, they lose another son. And it makes you wonder, in 21st century mindset, how these women would keep putting one foot in front of the other, having such loss in their lives. But they did. And here they are celebrating, getting ready to celebrate a marriage between their families, even as they mourn death among them. So, well, Hannah Reynolds, there she is, circled, surrounded by her other children and grandchildren. They're on the steps of Mt.Ida Plantation. And we decided once we finished our quilting tutorial, we decided to walk up the hill to the cemetery where Hannah is buried and pay our respects to this woman. A beautiful site for her resting place. So, and here is the site that we looked out at as we finished this quilt. So we sort of come full circle. We decided, yes, indeed, we were proud of this. We had had fun doing it. Yes, we felt much more connected to our neighbors. through working on this project together and learning more about the people who had lived on this land before we did. So there it is. There's our little quilt study on the left compared to the original quilt on the right. I think we did a jolly good job. Now, here it is. You can see quarter size of the original. And so the Mt.Ida Quilt project was drawn to a close. We sent it off to Milwaukee. It was well received. And once again, you'd think that this was all tidied up and done, right? Well, no. I had one more question. Why did Hannah Reynolds have this quilt that they made for her brother? Why was it at her house? Okay, just very quickly, let's see why this quilt ended up through Hannah Reynolds at Archives in History. Because isn't it lucky that it did? Okay, now let's go back. This is what we know. Here's the bride and here's the groom. We know that this quilt was made for them. So let's see why it ended up back in the hands of the groom's sister. Well, let's follow each of the 12 quilt makers and the bride and the groom. Anne Jenkins died just a month after this quilt was presented to the bride and groom. So Anne wouldn't have ended up with this quilt. Anne Wallace, as it turns out, just 3 years after this quilt was made, died of typhoid fever. So she was not a candidate to end up with this quilt. When Anne died, remember, she's the one that had the little daughter, Betty, that she named for her sister. Well, as it turned out, little Betty had been badly burned in a fire. And one of the other quilt makers, a cousin, adopted little Betty after Anne had died. This is a close-knit family. Well, Johanna Mallory, as it turns out, Johanna had moved off to Texas and Louisiana, where lands are cheap and rich. These young people were always looking for another opportunity. So Johanna, one of the quilt makers, had left Talladega County. Mary Jane, the youngest of the quilt makers, she had a tough time of it. She had a little son named Lewis who died in 1853 and was buried in Talladega County. And then in James Mallory's journal, he mentions that Mary had relapsed after the death of her son. And Sarah, her mother, one of the quilt makers, was very distressed. You can imagine you've lost a grandchild, your daughter is not dealing well with it. And then to make matters worse, Mary had another son, little Sandy, who only lived a year. Well, 2 little sons buried there in Talladega County. She probably said, you know what, I'm out of here. She and her husband moved to Selma, to the city. So 1860, they're gone. That means that Mary Jane is not a candidate for this quilt if it was going to be given back to them. 1860, we're all very well aware of the tensions that are starting to mount. James Mallory's journal gives us great insight into what might have been in the minds of these 12 women during this time of civil strife. 1860, James Mallory actually says he's going to stick with the Union as the South begins to divide itself off. He fears in March of 1861, fears that the new Confederacy is going to break away. And of course, in April of 1861, we know what happened there as shots were fired at Fort Sumter. Well, right after this outbreak of Civil War, Sarah Finley Welch, the stepmother of the groom, died. So she's not a candidate to end up with this quilt. Mary Jane Wilson Welch has had a tough time also. It seems that her husband perhaps was an alcoholic. She was probably dealing with things at home. And then her own son, Oliver Welch, died at the Battle of Atlanta. So she's dealing with her own grief and problems at home. She probably had more than enough on her hands. It gives us an idea through research online of perhaps the things that they were seeing as they stayed there in their homes. Rousseau made a raid through Talladega County, actually went by the house called Thornhill that still stands, took a lot of provisions there. They bypassed, went right past the house in the middle, Orangevale, and they did actually go to Mt.Ida and took horses and mules there. So all 12 of these women, perhaps, were watching Rousseau's raid come by their homes. What must they have felt? James Mallory says at the end of 1865, when the war had ended, it was a most eventful year for war, death, suffering, and yet they moved on. But their lives were changed forever. James Mallory says, 1869, the young folks are leaving. His son Oliver left. His son Frank went to New Orleans, to the big city of New Orleans. So did their youngest son, David. They went to where there was business opportunity for them. So these 12 women were seeing their families leave them because they lived on big farms and there was not enough family there to help them with the work that needed to go on. Mary Mallory died. And James Mallory then gives us another insight into what they must have been dealing with. Money was scarce. You couldn't sell your property because there was no market for it, and it was hard to obtain credit. So here they are in their big, fine, and fancy, plain and simple houses, but they have no opportunities anymore because of the change in the economy. Well, the bride who received this quilt caught the yellow fever and died in 1876. So her husband is left with this beautiful quilt, and he actually begins to look towards Florida for some reason. We know that he and his daughters moved to Florida in 1891. And did he need this big, heavy, wool-filled quilt in Florida? I don't know that he did. So let's look at where this quilt might have gone if the groom decided he really didn't want to take this quilt with him to Florida. Here are the 12 original quilt makers. The ones in red have already died. The ones in green have moved away from Talladega County. The ones in yellow are still living, but the ones, with the big X on them, those are the sisters-in-law. So they're not maybe as close to you as your own sister would be. Mary Jane Mallory is dealing with a lot of personal problems and grief. So that sort of leaves, and this is in my mind, that leaves the mother of the bride and the groom's sister, who lives in the house where they believe this quilt was actually put together. So this is my estimation, but in my estimation, I think he gave that quilt back to his sister or her family to keep it there. And it's a good thing that he did, because here is Hannah Reynolds and her offspring her adult children. And if her brother gave the quilt back to her, she put it in a trunk and it was carefully stored at Mt.Ida. And then it was passed down to her daughter, Jane Reynolds Crook, whom you see on the left circled in yellow. And then Jane Reynolds Crook's son, Walker Reynolds Crook, is the little boy's face that's also circled in yellow. And it was carefully kept and handed down to Walker Reynolds' daughter. Walker Reynolds Crook's daughter, Mary Reed Crook. And in 1858, through some stroke of luck for us all, she decided to donate the quilt to the Alabama Department of Archives and History. And this is what is left of the beautiful Mt.Ida plantation. Had she not donated that beautiful quilt, then perhaps it would have shared a sad fate that these columns represent. So aren't we grateful to Mary Reed Crook, who said, you know what, I have this quilt that I would like to give to your museum. And aren't we glad that these 12 21st century women took on this silly project about making a quilt and realizing that, you know what, it's not about making the quilt. In all that we do, in decorative arts, in quilting, it's really about sharing the knowledge and the experience. And so that is my story of the Mt.Ida Quilt Project. It was a great way to connect decorative arts and Alabama history and learn more about our own state and our own decorative arts. So that's my story, Carol. Let's send it back to you.
Well, thank you, Sarah Bliss. We have a couple of questions.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Can you see them?
From Joey, how likely do you think it is that enslaved women worked on these? I lost my question, but I think that was what you said.
Right.
I tried to pursue whether or not any of the slave owners might have used their sewing slaves, and there's no way to prove or disprove it, but it is possible that they might have used some of their sewing slaves to help them with it. I think it is likely that they in some way did, but no way to prove or disprove.
And we've got another question from Catherine Woodcock.
Hey, Catherine, okay, may I take this moment to tell anybody that's listening that Catherine Woodcock is the great-great-granddaughter of Hannah Reynolds. So got a family connection here. I'm so glad you joined today, Catherine. Catherine's question is, so how is cotton grown in the U.S. ginned ordinarily? Huge gins that would not have been able to you for your project. Exactly. If we had sent this cotton off to a huge ginner, this was one pillowcase full of raw cotton. And it would have not have been possible to have it ginned in the big gins now. That's why it was really lucky for me that I had found out about this little teeny tiny individual gin, because I wanted to be sure that we actually did get back our cotton, not just some old cotton. So yeah, it's big old industrial gins that are available today.
Well, thank you, all of our attendees as well. I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you so much, Sarah Bliss, for sharing this documenting process of local history and, of telling the people and the places that were such, a big part of what this quilt was able to tell. And of course, those of us who research quilts, we see all of these quilts that they've lost their story. And that's the magic about the Mt.Ida Quilt Project, is that that quilt found its story, and now that it also found a double as well. The quilt is, like like Sarah Bliss said, safe at the Alabama Department of Archives and History, the original quilt, as well as the reproduction quilt from the Mt.Ida quilt project. I want to thank everybody for attending, and I want to again thank the Alabama State Council on the Arts for supporting us. Our next Thursday morning, 10 o'clock, April the 29th, our presentation will be Joy Brackner, Slinging Mud, Alabama Potters, and Politics in the Late 19th Century. Thank you. We'll see you again next week.